Escape to Freedom by Ruth Fosdick Jones. Chapter 4. I didn't tell. The blossoms fell from the first settler. Little green cherries formed on the branches and swelled and ripened. The days grew warm. The 4th of July came and went. And school was altogether a burden, for school still went on all through July. It was unfair, Timothy thought, to have to be at lessons when there were so many more pleasant ways of passing the time. Besides, it was hot. Timothy could not remember a summer as hot as this one. His hand stuck to his arithmetic paper when he worked on his examples. The red color came off the cover of his grammar and stained his hands, and he could not keep his mind on learning when his whole being cried out for a good long swim in Skajakwada Creek. Even the excitement of the Underground Railroad paled in this weather. Slaves still came and went, sometimes 2 or 3 a week, sometimes none for 10 days, but there had been no more hair-breadth chases like the one in which Fred Andrew brought the Henrys to the house. Those who came arrived quietly, with a tapping on the window pane after dark, and vanished just as mysteriously with the creak of the floorboard in the hall. This meant that John Blaine was getting up in the small hours of the morning to set them across the river or take them to someone who could. Timothy had become used to his mother's trips across the yard with food for the slaves hiding in the shed. Sometimes he took the food himself to leave it for the poor creatures panting with the heat in the airless loft. It was like an oven up there, and Timothy would come out after 5 minutes with his shirt sticking to his back. It was only after dark, and darkness came late on these short summer nights, that Mr. Blaine could bring his guests into the comparative coolness of the kitchen. It was during these evenings that Timothy learned more about the Underground Railroad, for as the slaves ate a belated supper, or were refreshed with a cooling drink, his father questioned them. He found out not only who they were and where they came from, but he also learned as much as he could about how they got to his station. There were many places on the map of the United States which became more than names to Timothy that summer. They were stops on the road to freedom. From the counties of Virginia with their royal names, from remote and hitherto unheard of places in the states farther south, the slaves came. They traveled to Washington, across the mountains of Pennsylvania to Harrisburg, up the Susquehanna to Williamsport, to Elmira, and then northwesterly, avoiding all the large towns, to Buffalo. That was one way. Or they might come from Maryland, through Delaware to Philadelphia, across New Jersey to New York City, up the Hudson River to Albany or Troy, and westward through the Mohawk Valley to Syracuse, Rochester, Batavia, and Buffalo. That was another way. There were still others. The road to freedom might begin at Wheeling, cross the Ohio River, and follow a northerly course through Meadville, Pennsylvania to Lake Erie. There, all along the southern shore, the human cargo was smuggled on to the steamers which came at last to Buffalo. And everywhere along this extraordinary railroad were the watching eyes of men on the lookout for runaways. There were marshals, the instruments for carrying out the decrees of government, and there were also the slave owners who made the long journey into the free states and haunted the steamers, the ferries, the railway depots, or any other likely place in the hope of getting their property back. Hearing the stories the slaves told was not at all a bad way of spending the warm summer evenings, Timothy found. It was almost as good as reading Uncle Tom's Cabin over again, with a different cast of characters. There were real overseers as cruel as Simon Legree, hair-breadth escapes as exciting as that of Eliza crossing ice, and always interwoven with the stories of the fugitives, the unending kindness of those who helped these poor people escape. Some of them Timothy came to know by name. Thomas Garrett, the Quaker who lived in Wilmington, Delaware, who risked everything he had for God's poor, as he called them. William Still of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, even Levi Coffin, who ran the busiest station on the road, not far from the Ohio River. His passengers seldom came to Buffalo, but his reputation did. The more stories he heard, the more Timothy wondered what had led people like Thomas Garrett and Levi Coffin and the rest to start helping these fugitives. What had led his own father to do so? At last, one night, when they were sitting around the kitchen table, Timothy brought up the question. "Father," he asked, "how did you become a conductor on the Underground Railroad?" Mr. Blaine laid down the book he was reading. "You remember Gideon Parker, Tim?" "Yes, of course I do, Father," answered Timothy. Gideon Parker had lived in an imposing square house farther uptown at the corner of Linwood and Utica Streets, and had been a deacon of the church. He had died only a few months before. A tall, spare old man with a long white beard and kindly blue eyes. He always kept a bag of peppermints in the pocket of his coat, which he surreptitiously dealt out before church to any small boys within reach. For years, Timothy had made a point of trying to get to church at the same time as Deacon Parker did to ensure himself of this Sunday morning treat. Deacon Parker, Mr. Blaine proceeded, had known for some time that he had not long to live, and the good man was worried about the guests who came to his house. He, too, you see, was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Of course, there were other stations here in Buffalo, but he wanted someone to take over his work. He chose me, Tim. I guess he had seen that I was ripe for the plucking. Mr. Blaine smiled briefly. It took me a long time to come to it because I am at heart a law-abiding man, but the fugitive slave law I could not obey. You know what Mr. Emerson of Concord said about it." Timothy shook his head, though he well knew what Ralph Waldo Emerson was and his father's admiration for him. He called it a filthy enactment and gave fair warning to everyone of where he stood by saying, "I will not obey it." John Blaine's black eyes flashed. "And that filthy enactment, which makes it possible for a slave owner to take back a runaway slave, even when he finds himself in a state where slavery is outlawed, was signed by Millard Fillmore, a man who was born and brought up in Buffalo." Timothy had known that his father had no use for former President Fillmore, but he had not realized the reason for his bitter dislike. "Even after that, I hesitated for 2 years, Tim. I didn't want to get into trouble." Mr. Blaine snorted with self-contempt, as though any trouble I got into, or even got you or your mother into, would really matter as long as I helped even one of these poor creatures achieve his freedom. Gideon Parker taught me that night he called me to his house to see him about taking his place on the Underground Railroad. We had talked about this way of helping fugitives before, and he knew that he could trust me. He also knew, because he was a very shrewd old man, that it would not take much persuasion for me to become a conductor. But he did not intend to provide the kind of persuasion he did that night. We had barely warmed up to our subject when Mrs. Parker knocked on the library door and beckoned the deacon into the hall. She said something to him in a low voice, whereupon he put his head back into the room and asked me to excuse him for a few moments. He was gone less than 5 minutes, and we had just got to the heart of our conversation when there was a commotion outside and a violent knocking at the front door. The deacon answered the door himself, and a blustering, red-faced man strode into the hall. He carried a wicked-looking quirt in one hand and demanded in a loud voice, "Where is he? He was seen to come here, and I'll find him if I have to tear your house apart to do it." Behind him on the porch stood the marshal and 2 rather scared-looking deputies. It did not take me long to figure out that Gideon Parker had just hidden a slave in his house, and that this was his master coming to search for him. backed by the marshal with a search warrant. I hoped that the deacon had hidden his guest well. I decided that he must have thought he had anyway, for he was extremely self-possessed. He inquired the slave owner's business as though he had no idea what it was, ignored the man's rudeness, and offered to let him search the house from top to bottom, which, of course, having a warrant, he could have done anyway. Then he excused himself to me for the second time and accompanied the men while they performed their task. They must have been thorough, for it took them a long time, but they found nothing. And the roaring and temper that the slave owner displayed when he came in was nothing to that which he displayed when he left without his property, his quirt unused. After they had gone, the deacon returned to the library. I remember how he chuckled when he said, "Well, John, he would have had to tear the house apart to find this man. Come with me, and I'll show you. You know that house, Tim? How the front entrance is built out onto the porch? A kind of box with a door set in the middle with a wide windowless space on either side, so that it looks as though there was a large entry inside the door. Actually, there isn't. The entry is only the width of the door, and the rest of the area is boxed in space that might be closets, except that there are no doors. Or rather, you can't see any doors. But there are trapdoors opening from the cellar, so that on either side of the front door is a small closet with a door in its floor. Gideon Parker took me down to the cellar and showed me. Then he called to the slave hidden above us in the closet. "You may come out now, Seth. They've gone." John Blaine broke off and shifted in his chair. I had better warn you, Tim, that this story does not have a happy ending. There was no answer or any sound of movement above us. The deacon shouted and even knocked on the trap door, but still there was no response. Then I tried to push the door up, but the man's weight was on it, and I couldn't move it. It took us an hour to break into that closet, Tim. His father's voice was very grave. And when at last we did, we found that poor Seth had already won his freedom. Timothy stared at his father in horror. "Do you mean he was dead?" Mr. Blaine nodded. "Yes, Tim. He had had a long, hard trip from the South. He was old and almost worn out. Then he heard his master's voice through the closet wall and thought he was going to be captured. His terror was too much for his weakened body to withstand. He died of fright. That was the night I became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. I have never regretted it, and I never shall. No matter what happens, for it is the Lord's work, Tim. I am sure of it." Timothy took the tragedy of that story to bed with him and spent a restless night. But he was not sorry that his father had told it to him. It showed him that this was not just an unlawful and therefore dangerous adventure that his father was embarked upon. It could be, as it had been that night at Gideon Parker's, a life and death affair. More and more earnestly he wished that he could do something to help, really help, not in small ways only, like loading seed potatoes in a wagon, but in some big, important way. But no such dramatic chance came his way. And when he remembered how irresponsible he had been to lead Mike Considine right up to the kitchen door that day, he knew he didn't deserve that it should. Then suddenly, school was out, and the tragedies and opportunities for service on the Underground Railroad took second place in Timothy's life. Not that he spent all his days splashing in the creek. Far from it. For when school was over, John Blaine devoted himself to his carpentry business, and there were plenty of days when Timothy worked hard all day. But shingling a roof in the sun and open air or helping to saw fragrant new boards was a far better occupation for hot weather than sitting in a stuffy schoolroom. And there were those other days when he and Jake and the other boys did swim to their heart's content, or when they took a packet of bread and meat and spent hours fishing in the sheltered water of the harbor or along the creeks. There was even an occasional evening after work when Mr. Blaine and Sometimes Jake's father took the boys fishing. Mr. Blaine would get out his wagon with the hard wooden seats, hitch up Nellie, and take the road out Niagara Street past Mike Considine's house, past the ferry, to the village of Black Rock. On the shore of the little harbor, sheltered from the tumbling Niagara by the sandy barrier of Unity Island, John Blaine kept a heavy rowboat. And from there, they could row over to fish in the lee of Unity, or the high dune of Strawberry Island, farther downstream. Or, if their ambition held, they could drift with the river current down to the upper end of Grand Island and try their luck there for the pike and yellow perch that swarmed in the river. Then the happy tenor of vacation was abruptly broken, and Timothy could find no one to blame but himself. It was an important caller who started the unfortunate chain of events. For that particular evening, Mr. Charles Mooney called upon John Blaine. The visitor, short, stout, and almost bald, with sharp eyes and a loose lower lip that he had a habit of pulling in a considering manner as he talked, was the superintendent of schools in Buffalo. Timothy was very curious to know what this official wanted with his father, and he hung around the hall as long as possible, trying to find out the purpose for the visit. But as the superintendent never was content to use one word if he could use 100 in its place, the conversation between the two men in the parlor was still in the preliminary stages of comment on the weather when Mrs. Blaine called Timothy from the kitchen. "Tim," she said, closing the hall door firmly behind him, "will you please go out to the shed and get me some chips for the fire?" She picked up the wood basket from the hearth and handed it to him, and he saw in it the now familiar piece of sacking that meant there was a supper dish hidden beneath it. "That poor man out there will be famished with hunger if he waits to eat until your father has seen Mr. Mooney. I never knew anybody so long-winded." "What do you suppose he came for?" asked Timothy. "I don't know," answered his mother impatiently, "but if he leaves before an hour is up, he'll be way ahead of himself." "Oh, I shouldn't talk like that," she broke off. "He's a good man, and he tries to do his best. Tell our guest that your father will be out for him as soon as he can." She opened the back door and closed it softly behind the boy. Outside, the dusk was deepening into night, and the first settler cast a great black shadow over the rear of the yard. When he had closed the shed door behind him, Timothy was in almost total darkness. He groped his way up the ladder, whispered, "Here's your supper," and his mother's message to the black shape that showed up against the little four-paned window in the gable, and started back down the ladder. It was then that it happened. He missed his footing on the rough ladder and, hampered by the wood basket, lost his balance and fell with a crash on the shed floor. For a moment he lay where he was, dazed. Then a scared voice from above whispered, "You all right, sir?" "Yes," Timothy whispered back. "I'm all right. I just fell off the ladder." He started to sit up and knew at once that he was not all right. A searing pain shot through his left arm, and he didn't seem to be able to move it. He struggled to his feet, biting his lips to keep from crying out, and fumbling undid the door latch. His arm hurt so much that he thought he might be going to faint. Waves of darkness seemed to hover over his head, ready to swoop down on him. He leaned against the shed door and cradled his injured arm in his good one, and pushing the door closed as he did so. Then he stumbled across the yard to the house. The kitchen door was still closed, and he didn't feel like trying to open it. "Mother, let me in!" he cried, and hoped she would hear him. A sigh of relief escaped him as he heard her light step crossing the room. Then, as the door opened inward, he half fell into the room. "Tim!" cried his mother. She took one look at his white face. "What have you done?" Her arm came around him below his shoulders, holding him up. I think I've broken my arm, gasped the boy. Mary Blaine did not stop for any more questions. She flung open the hall door with the hand that was not supporting Timothy and broke in on the two men in the parlor. Tim's hurt himself, she said shortly, and as Mr. Mooney jumped up from the sofa, she laid Timothy down on it. He went out to the shed to get some chips for the fire, she said over her shoulder, as she arranged a cushion under the boy's head. A warning sounded in Timothy's brain. Don't mention the ladder. It kept hammering at his dazed mind like a clapper on the rim of a bell. Mr. Mooney is here. Don't let him know you went up in the loft. Careful now. Mr. Mooney is here. The hammering went on until he had to say something just to stop it. I fell over the wood box, he volunteered faintly. His mother had whisked her scissors out of her sewing box and was recklessly cutting the sleeve of his shirt away from his arm. Get me a pillow, John, she ordered sharply, and Timothy, opening his eyes, saw his bare arm with an unnatural bend in it between the elbow and the wrist. Mr. Mooney saw it too. I'll go for the doctor, Mrs. Blaine, he offered quickly. My rig's outside. No trouble at all, ma'am, he protested as Mary Blaine thanked him. And for once, wasting no words, Mr. Mooney let himself out the front door. John Blaine came back with a pillow. You raise his arm, Mary, he directed, and I'll slide the pillow under it. Gently, he cautioned as Mary Blaine tenderly lifted the broken arm. But she wasn't gentle enough. Timothy cried out with pain. And then the blackness that had been hovering over him swung down like a curtain and blotted everything out. At last, out of the darkness, he heard himself protesting weakly. I didn't tell. Didn't tell what? Asked his father. Timothy didn't open his eyes. He was in his own bed with a candle burning on the stand beside it, and his father was sitting in a low chair under the window. Didn't tell what? Asked his father again. Timothy frowned and collected his thoughts. I said I fell over the wood box, didn't I? He asked slowly. Yes, you did, his father assured him. But I take it that you really fell off the ladder. You are learning to keep your wits about you. His father's voice was full of affection. I'm proud of you, son, he said. Timothy smiled happily. It was almost worth breaking his arm to hear such things. His arm! He hadn't remembered it until then. He turned his head and saw it laid out on the quilt beside him, splinted by boards, and neatly bandaged with strips of torn linen. It is a good, clean break, and it is going to be all right, said his father, following his glance. How does it feel? Not too bad, answered Timothy bravely, though actually it throbbed and ached painfully. His father stood up and tousled Timothy's hair. Liar, he said, smiling. I'll send your mother up with the broth she has been making for you. It will do you good. And I must get our guest from the shed if I want to talk to him. That is, if he hasn't gone to sleep. It is almost midnight. His words brought Timothy back to the early evening. What did Mr. Mooney want, father? He asked. He wants me to take the principalship of the academy next year, besides teaching Latin, his father replied. Did you tell him you would? Asked Timothy after a moment. I didn't have the time to tell him anything before you presented yourself in a smashed-up condition, answered his father. But I think I shall. It is a step up, but, he added with a worried frown, it means that I shall have more responsibility and less time, and I must not neglect the guests who come to our shed. I'll help you with them, father. I'll help you all I can. Timothy assured him earnestly. I don't ever want us to lose a passenger the way Deacon Parker did. May God bless you, Tim. I know you will, said his father huskily. With a team like us, we shall be able to get every slave in the South over the river to Canada.